Hey, good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here with us on this sizzling and toasty day. We're glad you're here. I'm Katie. I'm with Erie County Department of Senior Services, and I coordinate the University Express program. We're here with Dr. Laurie Buonanno from Buff State, and we're super excited to have her telling us all about the current challenges of immigration policy and the history of that. But before we jump into her presentation, a couple housekeeping things like usual. We are recording this presentation, and if all goes as planned, I'll be able to post it by tomorrow likely, so keep an eye out on our website. Quick shout out to our sponsors, my Department of Senior Services, Highmark Blue Cross Blue Shield of Western New York, Excelsior Orthopedics, and Wegmans for all their support. And as always, Senior Services is here for you. So if you're looking for benefits, something to do, transportation, even if you're not sure what you're looking for, please start with us. We're at 858-8526. Now, the star of our show. Dr. Buonanno teaches Immigration and Refugee Policy in Buffalo State's MPA program and is director of the Institute for European Union Studies at SUNY. Her books, journals, articles, and book chapters focus on policymaking in the European Union, transatlantic policy, identity, migration, and local public administration. Her PhD is in political science from the Johns Hopkins University. And while she's going through her presentation, if you have any questions or comments, put those in the chat and we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end. If you're new, the chat's at the lower right-hand side of your computer screen. If you're on a tablet or smartphone, touch your screen. That brings up your control panel, and there you'll see the chat. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over. Thank you, Laurie.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks for inviting me to participate this year in University Express's programming. I've participated a lot in the past, never virtually, so please be kind to me. WebEx is new. I usually use Zoom or Microsoft Teams. But it looks great. So it looks like it works like Zoom. So I think we're going to be okay here. Okay, wow. Yes, I'm Laurie Buonanno, and I'm in the Department of Political Science and Public Administration, and I teach this course at the graduate level. So we have a course called Immigration. Well, it's actually Immigration and Migration Policy that's offered to our Masters in Public Administration students, and some graduate students from other departments will also take the course. And I typically teach it each spring semester. So what I'm doing here is just taking a portion of this course, basically what I thought would be of interest to the general public about immigration policy. So just a disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an immigration lawyer. I'm a political scientist. And so what we do in political science is we study policy. We look at past policy, current policy, look at trends to try to predict. And in my case, because I'm a comparativist, I compare US immigration policy and immigration policy in the European Union. And we actually see a lot of policy learning between the US and the EU. There's constant chatter across the Atlantic. And it's actually pretty interesting how we often see the policies in these two federal entities mirroring each other. So I see my controls should be down here. Here they are. So let's go ahead and get started. Let me start with what the New York Times, which I consider a newspaper of record, and what they argue are the terms that should be used, neutral and legal terms for migrants. So over here you see the terms that I tend to use, and then the process terms of actually how migration is taking place. So network migration is taken over from the term that has become pejorative, chain migration. Network migration is more commonly used in the literature now and among migration experts. Family unification is a process which is very important in US immigration policies. And for an individual enters without government permission, there are a lot of different terms. Undocumented tends to be used by migration advocates. Sometimes unauthorized is also used. So I'll use both terms. Irregular instead of illegal is used in the EU and increasingly in the US. In fact, the immigration policy reform that's in Congress right now requires the US government to begin, executive agencies to begin using irregular rather than illegal. And that's, again, policy learning based on what the European Union has been doing for years. Illegal is usually used by migration opponents, sorry for the typo. Unauthorized, and then regularization has been used by the EU to describe what we in the US call amnesty. It's considered a more neutral term, regularization, but we tend to use the term amnesty in the United States. So what are the key questions I want to try to get to today that I thought would be of the most interest for you? What do we need to know about the history of US immigration policy to understand the current state of play? What is the current legislative basis of US immigration policy? Is the US immigration system broken, which we're often told it is? And if so, should the 1965 legislation be replaced with new legislation? And is there the political will in Washington to overhaul the US immigration system? So just to be clear, our immigration policy today is based on a 1965 law. And everything we've had since has been tinkering with it, but there has been no comprehensive overhaul since 1965. And prior to that, it was 1924. So we aren't talking about a tremendous policy change that takes place every few years. We're talking, as is usual in a democratic system, we're talking especially a separation of power systems such as the United States, a presidential system. We're looking more at incremental change rather than more evolutionary, rather than more revolutionary or, really big changes at once. So this question is whether these incremental changes that we've made tinkering around the edges of this 1965 legislation has been enough, or if it's time for a complete rethinking of how immigration policy takes place in the United States. And of course, this is legislative, so this is something that Congress has to do. Let me just get rid of my controls so I can see what I'm doing here. Okay, so first of all, let's get some data out here. And in recent years, the US has issued about 1 million green cards annually. Now, the green card is for the lawful permanent resident. And in the United States, we call it a green card. In the EU, they call it a blue card. And it's been running about 1 million green cards annually, with about half of them issued to immigrants already in the US who are adjusting from another status. For example, being a student or a temporary worker. Especially, you hear a lot about the H-1B visa. That's a non-immigrant visa. However, it's one of the few visas that's dual intent. So someone can come and be a college professor, which we've had many in my department, in my career, many who were students in a US university. They come, we hire them on an H-1B visa in SUNY, and they're working on that H-1B while the SUNY lawyers and their own personal lawyer are working on them moving over to green card status, where there can be a lawful permanent resident. So that's an example of a dual intent. And there are no quotas on universities or nonprofit associations in terms of these green cards. And that's a really important issue in terms of the H-1B. I mean, that's a really important issue for universities, or it'd be very difficult for them to staff, especially in the STEM, in your science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. It would be very difficult for US universities to operate. I mean, we couldn't without those H-1B visas not being a quota for universities. We just need professors who are foreign born. About 2/3 of legal immigration to the US is on the basis of family ties. And so you can see this. And that compares to other rich countries. Those are the OECD countries, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. Those are our countries that we compare ourselves to in the United States. And the country average is more 40% for family unification. So what we see in the United States is family unification has been a lot more important to us. And that started in 1965 when Congress and the public debated over about 4-year period in the Kennedy administration. JFK sent what became the 1965 comprehensive immigration reform to Congress. It languished, and after his assassination, LBJ took it up and LBJ got it through. And New York was very, very important. Congressman Seller in New York was the one who sponsored and it's still today Manny Seller from New York, Brooklyn. He still today holds the record of the New York the New Yorker who was in Congress the longest. He was in for almost 50 years until Elizabeth Holtzman beat him in the Democratic primary. It was an earlier version of what happened with AOC and Crowley. Very, very similar kind of thing, a newcomer knocking on doors and unseating the veteran congressperson. So the AOC, what happened there was not new. It's happened many times. So you had a chance to look at those categories. So now let's look at, let me just try to get this chat out of here because I can't, with that chat box, it's hard for me to see. I do a printout on my slide, so I guess I'll do that. Okay, so what's the distinction between a refugee, asylee, and an immigrant? An asylee, we usually say asylum seeker, but you could say asylee too. Well, the distinction actually is almost new if you look at the whole history of immigration. It's a distinction that actually arose after World War II. The idea of a refugee and asylee and how we define it is actually international rather than US origin. We're a party, and the US is a party to the 1951 Geneva Convention on the Status of Refugees and the 1967 Protocol. And so the US Refugee Act of 1980 amended the 1965 Immigration Act in recognition that refugees were no longer just coming from Europe, which was the 1950 Geneva Convention focused on European refugees, and a recognition that it had become more global in nature and there were refugees and asylum seekers from everywhere. So an asylum seeker, refugee, it's all based on well-founded fear, which is a credible fear. So this is the idea that you can't send someone back. A country, according to the Geneva Convention, which again, the US is a party to, a refugee should not be returned to a country where they face serious threats to their life or freedom. Now, the international agency that deals with refugees is the UNHCR. And so it's the guardian of the 1955 convention. It's the place to go to look for reports on refugees, treatment, numbers. It's the agency that collects the data. The UNHCR is an agency of the UN. However, its contribution, it runs completely voluntarily by contributions from member states, and the US is the single biggest contributor. Now, if you take the EU, the 27 countries of the EU, and you put them together, of course, they're a bigger contributor. But if you look at just one country out of these 28 countries, US and the 27 EU, the US is the biggest financial sponsor of UNHCR. So a refugee is someone fleeing their country because of persecution or, and what we have written here, well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or public opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable or owing to such fear is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country. That's right from the convention. And so that's what the US uses. Now, the question always comes in, so we have this legislation, but the question always is, how is legislation implemented? So if you're trying to distinguish between political science and public administration, this department I'm in teaches both. The political science part of it is agenda setting and what Congress does, the legislation part of it, and how does that legislation, how is it written? How does it get through? How does it fail? But once legislation is passed, this now moves into the executive branch to implement. And so public administration is all about how laws are implemented. So if you think what Katie does, if you take Katie as an example, Katie is a public administrator. So the Erie County Legislature and the New York State Legislature make laws, and then they need to be implemented. Well, someone has to implement those laws, and those are the public administrationists. They're the public servants. They're the unelected officials who are behind the scenes taking direction from the elected officials. And so this is where immigration policy really becomes important to understand the distinction between what happens politically and then what happens when it's moved over to the executive branch to implement. And do remember that immigration law is federal. It's in the federal arena. It's not under state jurisdiction. It was until Grover Cleveland was president and the federal government took it over. And the New York State was an important state lobbying for the federal government to take over because New York State could not afford to run immigration. It was running it out of something called Castle Garden. New York State was going broke on this. New York State couldn't afford the public administration aspect of it, and it was a corrupt system. And New York State threw up its hands, and they and some other states fought for the federal government to take immigration policy over. I only mention this now because we can see how some states are unhappy with it, such as Texas, which is constantly, Arizona and Texas, constantly trying to assert themselves and take on what is in law the federal role. And this is where you get all this this really interesting intergovernmental conflict between states on the southwestern border and the federal government in immigration control. You get that same kind of, in a reverse in New York State, where, for example, our green light law, which President Trump went after, allowing undocumented immigrants to get a driver's license and get car insurance. And the Trump administration tried to punish New York State over it. And then in the end, New York State changed the law in a way that satisfied the federal government, and the green light law held. So refugee versus asylum seeker, these are sometimes confused. Now, in the federal government, in terms of processing, it's very similar. An immigration lawyer could sit here and give you all the intricacies of how you apply based on refugee or asylum where you are. But I will say that an asylum seeker is someone who has applied for refugee status, but whose claim has not yet been definitively evaluated by government officials. In other words, the asylum seeker is someone who comes to a port of entry, and when questioned by the customs border officer, will say, I am asking for asylum in the United States. So at a port of entry, or someone who's already here, for instance, going to college, and when it comes time to leave, or maybe even before, they present themselves as an asylum seeker, and that does happen. So let me just go back in case someone's on the phone and can't hear, needs to hear this. The U.S. granted asylum status in 2019 to 46,500 individuals who had presented themselves at a U.S. Port of entry. So the Refugee Act of 1980, it formalized the process of how someone can be admitted as a refugee. And the law states, the Congress said up to 50,000 a year. However, that legislation, very importantly, gives presidential discretion, so that the President of the United States, through the U.S. Attorney General and working with Department of Homeland Security, DHS, can take account of changing situations. So in 1980, we actually admitted 270,000 refugees. Now, look at that year, 1980. You're talking about South Vietnam. I mean, you're talking about Vietnam War. So these are Vietnamese and Cubans, a lot of Cubans. So, but then you see how it drops by 2016 tremendously. We see a lot of conflict here in world conflict. So we had an increase, but President Trump began to decrease this dramatically. And in 2020, 18,000 was the lowest ceiling since the program was enacted. And then 2021, the Trump administration set it at 15,000. But one of Joe Biden's promises, if he was elected, would be to increase it. And he did change it to 62,500. But importantly, only 11,500 refugees were admitted. Why? This is where public administration comes in as well. What had happened during the Trump administration is the refugee resettlement infrastructure had been flattened. And so places including Erie County, where we do a lot of refugee resettlement, had laid off so many people and their budgets had been decimated that they did not have the ability to resettle refugees. So if that system of resettling refugees, which is not a federal responsibility, federal government decides who can come in, but then refugees are meted out to refugee resettlement agencies. If those agencies, which are nonprofit and religious organizations, aren't capable of resettling, we can't bring them in. Fiscal 2022 is 125,000, but there's no way we're going to meet that. Not even close. And then here, if you're wondering who the refugees in 2021 were admitted, these are the top countries for 2022. 2022, this is going to change, obviously, with Afghanistan. But a lot of the Afghans aren't officially refugees. There's something called parole, which is a presidential prerogative, and they don't have the same benefits that refugees have. So it's not as desirable, but you can get them in faster. And it's just taking too long to get Afghans where there was a credible fear. And so a lot came in under the parole program. So here's some country of origin for asylum seekers. In 2019, we have more, we have better, the best data from 2019 at this point. So these 5 countries made up 48% of those receiving asylum in 2019. And that's important because 2019 is prior to COVID. Once we get into COVID 20 and 21 figures, they're less representative of what the patterns have been. But the backlog, and they're called pending cases, the end of 2021, there were more than 432,000 affirmative asylum cases. These go through the United States Citizen and Immigration Services, which is really a benefit agency. Except for refugee status, everyone has to pay for those services. The USCIS taxpayers don't support. It's pretty much supported by all the different kind of visa applications. A lot of Americans don't realize that, but it's actually considered a benefits agency. And nearly 629,000 defensive cases. Those defensive cases, what we mean by that is they're in the immigration courts. So they're through the Department of Justice rather than a Homeland Security. Remember, USCIS is an agency within DHS, whereas this is, once you get into these defensive cases where it's an individual's last chance to try to stay in this country and prove a credible fear case, those are the ones you're hearing about in these immigration courts. And of course, we have federal immigration court in Buffalo, which is very active and very backlogged. The other area that you read about a lot in the paper is temporary protection status. So remember, none of these people are considered immigrants. We have refugees, asylees, and then we have TPS holders. A temporary protection status, this was enacted by Congress in 1990 for migrants who are already present in the US. So someone cannot get in on TPS status if they're outside of the US. So it's someone already here and applies for temporary protection so they don't have to go back home these are for 18-month periods usually. And what's happened is the president, under presidential discretion, the administration will decide certain countries are unsafe. They could be natural disasters, protected unrest, or conflict. Right now, there are 320,000 TPS holders in the US. And very importantly for person-to-person diplomacy, these individuals send a lot of money home. Those are called remittances. And the United States government is very cognizant of this money that is being sent home, that is sometimes supporting entire communities, this money. And so there's a lot of concern that if you kick these TPS holders out, there go the remittances, and then the US will have to make it up through foreign aid. So rather than individual contributions, the US would have to step in. So this is a really difficult, TPS is a very difficult, controversial policy issue with a lot of nuances dealing with economics and budgets. So the TPS does not include a path to lawful permanent residency. So it's not a path to the green card or citizenship, although a TPS recipient can apply for either. But if they're in here undocumented, a TPS holder, no, someone who's undocumented can't then suddenly get a green card. There's all kinds of rules about when someone's undocumented and having to go home first and so on and so forth. And these are the sorts of issues that immigration lawyers deal with. These are the countries over the years since the TPS started that have granted TPS status designation. So you can see over the years all these countries, and then the years that the designation took place. And where do TPS beneficiaries come from? Here you have estimated eligible under 2021 and 2022 designations. That's really important because that gives us an idea of what we're in for when the president gives a TPS. And here's where the TPS holders are right now, from El Salvador, Haiti, and Haiti's been renewed. And so the current controversy is how long TPS holders have been here, because many have been here for more than 20 years. And this question is, why is it called temporary if some people really, their lives are here? Remember, a TPS holder can work. So they're working. Most TPS holders are working. It's over 88%, I believe, actually are working full time or working, contributing, paying taxes, contributing to the US economy. So the current controversy is migrants' rights supporters want TPS reforms to offer a path to obtain permanent residency. Again, they do not have that now. And so that's something that's in this package that President Biden submitted on his first day of office to Congress. It's like this reform includes TPS. So there we have it. President Biden has expanded the TPS to Venezuelans, Afghans, Ukrainians, and Burmese. Again, they have to already be in this country. And extended TPS for Haiti, El Salvador, Nepal, and Somalia. These latter due to COVID-19, and Haiti due to continued political unrest. And then Cities for Action, mayors of several cities have been lobbying Congress to grant TPS to other countries due to war and natural disaster. But the fact is, asylum seekers, refugees, and TPS holders that we read so much about in the newspaper present a tiny portion of immigration to the US. Now, here what you see from 1850, where we begin, the census begins looking at where someone's born. So the size and share of the foreign-born population in the US, I'm sorry, it's 1850 to 2019. And what you can see here is this increase of number of immigrants from 1970. The immigrant share of the population has varied. So you see in the peak years of immigration, 1890, and then we're up to that in 2019. So you can't look at raw numbers of immigrants without looking, you have to look at percentage of US population. So there's no question, just to get the facts on the table, there's no question that right now we are at the second highest point compared to those peak years between 1880 and 1920, when there was massive European immigration. It was mainly European immigration, and mainly from Southern and Eastern Europe from 1880 to 1920. So the top 10 largest immigrant groups, you can see Mexico, and Mexico has been declining, by the way. If you want figures during chat, I can give them to you. Let me just move forward in my notes, because I don't, have all the figures in my head. So I can give you some better idea here. Yeah, okay. So what we're dealing with is of the 44.9 million immigrants in the US of 2019, and we have to use 2019, excuse me, because those are the latest data we get broken down by gender and age and so forth. So the immigrants and their US born children number approximately 84.8 million. So if we combine foreign born with first generation, we get 84.8 million people. And that was 26% of the US population in 2021. Okay, That's foreign born and their children born here, first generation. Pew Research Center has projected that the immigrant origin of the population, again, foreign born and first generation, will rise to be about 36% of the US population by 2065. Okay, so obviously immigration policy is important. We're talking 26% of the US population, foreign born and first generation, and projections to rise to 36% by 2065. This raises not only questions about our immigration policy, who we let in, how we let them in, but how we assimilate. So how there's acculturation and inclusion policies of first generation, which is not done at the federal level. The only federal involvement is the US citizenship exam. States and localities and nonprofits are responsible for integrating immigrants, not the federal government. And that's not true in all countries, but it's true in ours. So although the US controls numbers and visas and so forth, the US doesn't really get involved in how we ensure that how people become American. And of course, the school districts are a big part of this too, because schools are a major institution for assimilation. Just to mention though, we tend not to use the term assimilation as much as we used to. Now it tends to be inclusion, acculturation. So you'll hear that more, and you'll hear integration. You will not hear the term multiculturalism very much anymore. That sort of has gone out of fashion. So Mexicans are the largest group with 24% of the total, and that's a decline of 30% since 2000. Why? Mexicans are getting older. Mexicans aren't crossing like they used to. We're seeing more from Central America than Mexico now, because Mexico is an aging population, and immigration is a young person's game. It's older people who immigrate are people who are sponsored, parents and grandparents. Most immigrants are working age, finished high school, and they're here to work. So China 6%, India 6%, Philippines 5%, El Salvador, Vietnam, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic 3% each, Guatemala and South Korea 2% each. These groups that I just listed, these national origin, these countries, account for 57% of all immigrants in the US in 2019. So those ones you're seeing broken down account for 57%. In the 1960s, no single country accounted for more than 15% of the US immigration population, but Italians were the top origin group in 1960 at 13%. So European group was at the top in 1960s, and that was because of earlier immigration up to 1924, and then with immigration reform in 1965, a lot of Italians were able to sponsor, a lot of Italians and Polish, I mean, the really large groups were able to sponsor sisters and brothers, I mean, siblings. That's family unification was emphasized, and the Polish community, the Italian community, the Greek community, and so on, really lobbied for that 1965 reform to be based on family unification. And then in 1960s, behind Italians of the foreign born in 1960 was followed by Germans and Canadians with about 10% each. So post 1970, Mexicans were the largest group coming in, but now it's Indians and Chinese for new arrivals. And number of Mexican immigrants in the US declined by more than 780,000 between 2010 and 2019. So that's the largest absolute decline. So to try not to inundate you with data, but it's how Congress and the executive branch make their decisions on immigration. So the history of immigration legislation. This is easily available in Wikipedia articles, on Immigration Resource Center sites. So I'm just going to go through this quickly just to lay the foundation for what happened in 1965. So the Immigration Act of 1882 was the first attempt at broad federal oversight. So this is when the federal government gets control of immigration, is trying to get control, and it's upheld by the Supreme Court, by the way, because some states are against it in the South. Southern states are against the federal government taking control. It's a long history why Southerners had been against it, even Southern Democrats, and it had to do with basically intergovernmental rivalry, because immigrants were attracted to the West, the Midwest, and the Northeast, and were not coming to the Southeast. And this was ticking the Southern delegation off, that immigrants didn't want to live in the South. So Chinese Exclusion Act of 18, so likely to be a public charge LPC doctrine, which is still relevant in the United States today. We saw LPC reemerge during the Trump administration, first during the Clinton administration with welfare reform, and then again in the Trump administration. So that's important, the likely to be a public charge. If someone's likely to be a public charge, they're not going to be admitted. Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 suspends immigration of Chinese laborers for 10 years. It effectively shuts the door to Chinese immigration. The Immigration Act of 1917 creates what's called an Asiatic barred zone, covering India, Southeast Asia, and almost all of the Middle East. So inadmissibility includes anarchists and illiterate over age 16. So that's where the literacy test is. This is where Buffalo becomes a very important port of entry, because Buffalo was so understaffed. People who were illiterate, who couldn't pass a literacy test, would figure out to come through Buffalo rather than Ellis Island. So Buffalo became a very big port of entry. And there's all kinds of oral histories about immigration officers not being able to handle it. Buffalo also became a very important illegal entry point, because there were so many ways to get through the North Country in Buffalo. So people who didn't feel they could fake it in Ellis Island would come through illegally through Canada. And if you scratch the surface, you're going to find a lot of Buffalonians with grandparents and great-grandparents where at least one of them came in undocumented. And there's a lot of people doing research on that, trying to uncover the extent to which Europeans today, descendants of European, late generation European immigrants, are actually the descendants of undocumented immigrants from Europe. It's all started with 1917. The Emergency Quota Act of 1921 is Congress's first attempt to regulate immigration by setting admission quotas based on nationalities. They'd already barred Asians. Now the nativists, so the anti-immigrant groups, are now going after Southern Europeans and Eastern Europeans, and they're successful. By 1924, they established, this is the National Origins Quotas Act, they established quotas based on 2% of each nationality's proportion of the foreign-born U.S. population in the 1890 census. What that meant was that Southern and Eastern Europeans, because in 1890 there weren't many of them, it slammed the door shut. So that was it for Southern and Eastern Europeans getting into the United States until the 1965 Immigration Reform Act. So there were literally quotas, and the reasoning was those who backed it and got it through Congress was that they wanted more Western Europeans, Northern Europeans, British, German, Danish, and so forth, Swedish, and they did not want Italians and Polish and Romanians and Greeks, et cetera, et cetera. So 1904, and that changed, that slammed the door for those groups. Many of those groups, of course, were already, major immigrant groups in Buffalo, of course, by that time. 1942 to 1964, the Bracero Agreement is a guest worker program agreed between the U.S. and Mexico, and it ends in 1964. I mention this because guest worker programs are extremely important in Europe and in the United States, and they've been also very controversial. So 1952, the Immigration and Nationality Act preserves the national origins quota system despite intense lobbying by especially Southern and Eastern European immigration rights groups. They don't make a dent. The national origins quota system remains, and Asians are assigned quotas for the first time. So now there's an opening for Asians to enter the United States. And there'd always been loopholes if an Asian individual wanted to emigrate and they were of outstanding skills, such as a physician, a physicist, an actor, an artist, those sorts. I mean, people could always get in if they were deemed by the U.S. government to contribute substantially to the U.S. Economy and culture. Refugee Relief Act of 1953 allows up to 205,000 non-quota immigrants fleeing persecution or were expelled from their homes in Europe. The Migration and Refugee Act of 1962 is to be able to bring Cubans in. So the big one that we need to know about is the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965. Here we see, there's a photo, I have up a photo of LBJ signing this at Ellis Island. And of course you see here Robert Kennedy, who by then was a senator of New York. And we see Ted Kennedy. The Kennedy family were always huge advocates of ending national quotas. John F. Kennedy had written about it in his book, A Nation of Immigrants. The bill's sponsors were Hart. That's why it's called the Hart-Celler Act. It's nicknamed Senator Hart of Michigan and Congressman Celler from New York. Celler, as I mentioned, was a congressman for almost 50 years, from 1923 to 1973. And by then, Ted Kennedy was senator of Massachusetts. He had run when his brother became president in a special election. And then after that term was fulfilled, he continued to run and win. So that's why they're there at the signing. It abolished, go to the next slide. The 1965 Act finally abolished the national origins formula, which was so detestable to especially Southern and Eastern European descendants and immigrants themselves. Created priority system based on family unification, professional, skilled individuals, and refugees. So family unification becomes for the first time a key feature in the 1965 Act and continues. I'm going to reiterate this. I know I talked about it earlier in the slideshow, but it's extremely, extremely important to U.S. policy. There are country limits and immigration numerical limits, but not for immediate relatives, and that are spouses, minor children, and parents. And it included quotas on the Western Hemisphere, which had never existed in earlier laws. And this is where we get all the problem with undocumented immigrants from Mexico, because there had never been quotas, and now suddenly there are quotas. Now, what I'm going to go through very quickly, I just want this up here because I assumed it'd be recorded, or at least by PowerPoint would be made available. And so I'm just going to leave this on the screen for a moment, where you can see in 1986, 1990, 1996, 2006, and we have another slide. They don't all fit on one slide. Well, I think my other slide's later, actually. Yeah, 2012. I have another slide 25. So we'll leave this here. All of these deal with tinkering with the 1965 legislation, and particularly dealing with border control on the southern border. So we have more restrictions, unlikely to be a public charge. We have caps on H-1B, changes to the caps on H-1B, and H-1B, remember, are these skilled individuals who can then dual intent, who can then apply for permanent LP. Lawful permanent residency or green card. Very, very, very important. And we have the illegal immigration reform and immigrant responsibility, starting this E-Verify system, which allows employers who can voluntarily go in and be able to check immigration status to make sure they're not hiring undocumented individuals. And it's the beginning of these controversial 287G programs that allow law enforcement agencies to carry out federal immigration enforcement. Because what a lot of Americans, for some reason, don't understand is the federal government does not have much of a policing presence. The police in the United States and in the United Kingdom, where we learned our policing from, we imported it, the British settlers, is that policing is considered a local responsibility in the United States as it is in the UK. It's very different in Italy and France, for instance, where they have a national police. We don't have, the FBI is not a national police. They're not a uniformed police. So the truth is, the federal government cannot carry out immigration enforcement as it would like to. So what it did in 1996 was establish a program where they could partner up with willing local agencies. They can be county sheriffs, they can be local police, like municipal police, like the city of Buffalo, which is not part of this program, and state police. And you can go on the USCIS site, you can type that in, and you can see all of the local law enforcement agencies that have 287G programs with the federal government. Just a clue. Last I looked, only I think the Schenectady in New York State. I haven't looked for about a year now, but it's not popular in New York State. Okay, so you might wonder how many unauthorized immigrants living in the US. There are 11 million. That's the estimate. And in New York State, there's 835,000. Most unauthorized immigrants are just living in a few states. They're in New York, they're in Illinois, they're in California, they're in Florida, they're in Texas, they're in Arizona. You know, those are where there's just a few states actually. So when people, all these other states, individuals from these states, like senators and Congress people are going on and on about unauthorized immigrants, they don't even have many in their states. So it seems to me that New York State has an important, we have a dog in this fight, let me put it that way. We have a lot of unauthorized immigrants living in New York State. It is an issue for New York State. It's something New York State should be and is concerned about. So now in terms of other action, this next action, I've given you the legislation. Now let's talk a little bit about executive action. When Congress can't make progress, what happens? The president legislates. I know the president is the executive branch. Their role is to administer and enforce the law. But the fact is, the president does have power to legislate through something called executive action. There's all kinds of different executive actions. And so the Dreamers, allowing people who were brought here as youngsters to the United States who were born in another country, they're called the Dreamers. The deferred action for childhood arrivals is an executive action. The problem with executive action is that the next president can come in and abolish it. The president can't come in and abolish congressional law. That's legislation that's been passed and signed by the president. Only Congress can do that. So it's very tenuous, and it creates a lot of uncertainty for individuals and for employers. There was a Dreamers Act, believe it or not. It was actually administered. It was actually introduced by a Republican and a Democrat in 2001. That's how long they've been trying to get a Dreamers Act through Congress. President Trump rescinds it, and President Biden reinstates it. One of the first things he does when he takes office, he promised it, and in his campaign, and so now those who were already in the Dreamers program, the deferred action for childhood arrivals, DACA, are, at least for now, can stay and can work and go to school. Now let's get to the central question of what's happening now. Two things. During the Trump administration, the RAISE Act was introduced. It didn't get anywhere. Just to let you know where Congress is on this. In 2017, supported by President Trump, introduced by Republican senators, it was to reduce the number of green cards from the more than 1 million on average every year to 500,000, and the diversity lottery. A few thousand every year coming on the diversity lottery, and countries are in the diversity lottery are from countries where we don't get a lot of immigrants, to try to make our population more diverse. And it's not that long ago the diversity idea came in. That was actually Schumer sponsored it when he was a congressman. He pushed it through. A reduced employment-based system to a point system, and a maximum of 140,000 points-based immigrant visas would be issued per fiscal year, and spouses and children would be counted against the cap. And it would also remove pathways for siblings and adult children of U.S. citizens and LPRs to apply. So that would be it for them. They couldn't get in unless they could get in some other way, like through qualifications. Now, what's going on now is what's in Congress now is the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021. So that's what's in Congress, and right now it's going nowhere. Remember, when a bill is introduced, it has less than 2 years, because when that Congress is finished, the next Congress comes in and has to start all over again. So remember, let's keep that in mind. So proposed by President Biden on his first day in office, it's very complex. It's a complete reform from the 1965. So lawful prospective immigrant, for the 11 million undocumented immigrants, there's a pathway for them to obtain green cards. The legislation contains criminal and national security background checks required, and they must have been paying taxes. People who've been providing critical services would be eligible for LP for a green card. Temporary agricultural workers and TPS recipients. So this is a big change. Non-citizens who entered the U.S. as children, including DACA recipients, would be eligible for the green card. And then TPS and deferred and forced departure from certain countries would be eligible for LPRs. This is a big change. And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff in there, and I'm just going to point out the ones that have been very controversial over the years. Per country caps for family and employment-based immigrants would increase from 7% of the worldwide total to 20%. This, the Chinese and Indian governments have been lobbying for, and as well as Chinese and Indian support groups in the United States, because there's a huge backlog, especially for Indians who are trying to switch from the temporary H-1B visa, the non-immigrant visa, to green cards. I personally know of several people being in academia who have been waiting years for a green card because of these caps. It also would address the root cause of migration and provide programs for immigrants from Central America. It contains a lot about border security and training for border control officers, border patrol officers, and foreign graduates of U.S. universities with advanced STEM degrees would not be subject to numerical limits. That's a big one. It's basically when someone crosses the stage and gets a master's degree or PhD in a STEM field in a U.S. university who's foreign born, they're almost handed an application for a green card. And DHS and Department of Labor would establish a new commission that would look at employment verification and make recommendations. So then we have to ask, what is the likelihood that the 117th Congress will pass immigration legislation? And what will happen if the Congress can't pass immigration reform legislation? And what I put up here is what we see in Biden's plan, that he's ready to go with executive action as the only recourse. And so this will be, why did I talk about public administration and the difference between that and political science? Because what their plan is to gear up to make sure there are enough federal employees to start fast tracking these applications for LPR and naturalization for citizenship. So if you have enough people, what President Trump's administration did is actually starve the USCIS of resources. They're going to go the other way, and they're going to start hiring and create, and they're going to also streamline the process, the application process. And the president has the power to do that because the executive branch implements the law. Create pathways for foreign entrepreneurs who want to start businesses in the U.S. and revamp programs to assist immigrants with help with law enforcement, because those who testify against criminals, that's a U visa program, and they're supposed to be fast tracked, and they're not. That's not happening right now. Fast track to long-term permanent residence. So that's the end of my show. I took the chat off. So I don't know if questions have been coming in or if they're going to come in now.
Well, Lori, thank you so much for that. We've got a couple things in the chat right now. So people, if you've got things, put them in. But the first thing I'm seeing is thank you so much for explaining all the terms. This was in the beginning. They finally make sense to me, which I agree with that. You had touched on this, but I'm not sure if there's anything else you wanted to say about it. This is wondering, can you explain the difference between assimilation and acculturation? Maybe there's something else.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, typically, first of all, it's sociologists and anthropologists who mainly deal with assimilation, acculturation, integration, inclusion. But over the past decade or so, political scientists have jumped in because it's a very rich area. Now, assimilation traditionally means it's the path, and there are all kinds of theories on the path of foreign-born and first generation. That is, their parents are born in another country, but they themselves are born in the United States, first generation. And I'm defining that because some people, well, their grandparents, since they were born in Italy, and they'll say they're second generation. They are not second generation, they are third generation. Governor Cuomo used to refer to himself as second generation. No, his grandparents were born in Italy. That makes him third generation. His parents were second generation. They were first generation. So I should just, I'm kind of confusing everyone with the way I'm talking about this. So let's talk about it the way a sociologist would. So a sociologist would say, okay, assimilation is that foreign-born are actually first generation because they're beginning to assimilate. And then a sociologist would define second generation as the ones who were born in the United States. So, political scientists tend to, we tend to kind of misuse this sometimes. And I know during the show I did because I'm a political scientist, but actually the people working on this, the people who really know what they're talking about, the sociologists and the anthropologists, argue that we really need to call foreign-born first generation and the ones born here second generation. They're betwixt and between. So what they argue is that assimilation is a process, and by the third generation, that is, grandparents were born in a foreign country, they're completely assimilated. And that is, they're American, they no longer have an instrumental identity to that country of origin, they now have a symbolic identity. And that symbolic identity we see demonstrated through, let's say, going to an ethnic festival. For Italians, maybe going to a Saints' Day feast, this sort of thing, maybe the Sunday dinner. But that these are mere shadows of what the life was like for the person who was foreign-born and for their children. That is, the first generation foreign-born, and if we say second generation born here. So that's what assimilation means. Acculturation is really basically the same thing, but assimilation began to take on a pejorative meaning by those individuals who were promoting multiculturalism. So multiculturalism is the idea that all of these different cultures can coexist and that there's not one mainstream culture in a country, whether that's Germany or the UK or Canada or Australia or the United States. Multiculturalism is associated with more left of center, and acculturation and integration became associated with more right of center. That has since changed, where basically mainstream thinking now is that acculturation should be the goal of any immigrant receiving country. It's inevitable, and that the institutions that are responsible for assimilation, acculturation, just need to be more sensitive about it. So if there's a difference, it was that assimilation was something that was sort of thrust on individuals who were trying to retain some remnant of the country of origin culture. Whereas acculturation is the idea, look, this is inevitable, but it needs to be, the process needs to be done in a sensitive way where the individual isn't being told that the country they came from was a hellhole, a stinking rotten place, and that there's something to celebrate about their country of origin. and their ethnic roots. But at the same time, they're moving towards what American mainstream culture is. And so that integration, that's part of it, integration policy, is helping those children of foreign born, because it's not really the third generation that need help. If you look at third generation Latinos, many of them can't even speak Spanish. They want to learn Spanish, they can't speak it. And a lot of them are just frankly ashamed. Just as third generation Polish and Italian are ashamed, the grandchildren, that they don't speak Polish or Italian, or third generation Greeks, for instance. So it's the same thing as going on in the Latino community. And so integration is the idea that tools are given to help that first generation and also their children be successful in American society. This isn't really a problem in the United States. So this integration literature is more coming out of Europe. These countries that were traditionally immigrant sending countries are now immigrant receiving countries. Ireland and Italy are now immigration, and Poland are immigration receiving countries. And Italy and Ireland particularly are doing a lot of soul searching, like, how do we treat immigrants? Because so many of our people left and they were welcomed into all these other countries. So how do we help these new immigrants become Irish or Italian in a sensitive way? So it's integration really isn't as much of a challenge, I would say, in the United States, because Canada, United States, and Australia are traditional immigrant receiving countries, and we know how to integrate foreign born in these other countries. We know how to do it in a sensitive way. And these other countries are really struggling. What does it mean to be Italian? What does it mean to be Irish? Especially when nationality is blood-based rather than civic-based. In the United States, our identity is a civic identity. It's not a blood-based identity. Whereas in these European countries, they're struggling with this issue where Italian is blood-based, not necessarily a civic identity. And that gives the United States and Canada and Australia a huge advantage in integration, because we require immigrants and their children especially to adopt the American civic culture. And we do that beginning in pre-K.
Wow, that's all really interesting. Thank you so much for explaining it in such a clear way and so detailed too. Now I know we're at time here. Do you have a couple more minutes?
Oh, sure, I can stay.
Okay. Okay, perfect. So a question that just came in before I get to some of the comments is, any thoughts on the term melting pot, and is that even still used?
Yeah, melting pot really isn't used much anymore, because melting pot was associated with assimilation. But I mean, the last major book was Beyond the Melting Pot by our own senator, before he became Senator Moynihan, and Nathan Glazer. They are both sociologists. That was a landmark book where they looked at assimilation in New York State, especially New York City. And there's even a chapter on Italians, chapter on Puerto Ricans, chapter on African Americans, and so forth. It's still a relevant book. I have it on my shelf. I look at it once in a while. So melting pot isn't used as much, but melting pot is sort of, it's really a synonym for assimilation.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. This comment is, this highlights the major impact that policy can have, which I agree with that. And then knowing the background on this issue is incredibly helpful.
Well, yes, I mean, any of you who are descendants of Southern and Eastern Europeans, this is really part of your history. And if you're wondering why at one point the Polish neighborhood dried up in Buffalo, and the Italian neighborhoods and other neighborhoods of other, especially Eastern European, it was because of the 1920 and the 1920s, the early 1920s, those national origins. And it was specifically targeted Southern and Eastern Europeans. And this is a really important issue to Buffalonians, because Buffalo, as with most Northeastern cities and Midwest cities, are revived through immigration. And we see this right now, especially through refugee resettlement. The reason why Buffalo's population increased when the mayor made the announcement about the first increase, since the 1950s, the decline since the St. Lawrence Seaway upset our whole economy in Buffalo. He said a lot of this can be attributed to the new Americans. And there's no accident why the county government and the city government both started New American programs a few years ago, because Buffalo is back to being an immigrant receiving city. And if you look at when immigration started increasing rapidly after 1970, that's because the 1965 law kicked in. And what happened? Immigrants started coming in and living in neighborhoods that older immigrants had lived in and then had moved to more spacious, commodious, like the suburbs. One of the most famous books was written by Mario Puzo, the author of The Godfather, called The Fortunate Pilgrim. He wrote that as a young man before he became famous with The Godfather. And it's about an Italian-American family modeled on his own that's struggling in a tenement on 10th Avenue in Hell's Kitchen in New York City. And at the end of the book, spoiler alert, they finally reach their goal, which is what for a New York City Italian? To move to Long Island, to move to Long Island. As those neighborhoods to get enough money to finally get out of the neighborhood and move to Long Island. Now, when people left the neighborhoods, they lost their ethnicity. Another great book I would recommend if you're looking at ethnicity is Mount Allegro, written by a Rochester Sicilian, Jerry Mangione, Chuck Mangione's uncle. He talks about the Sicilian, Polish, Jewish neighborhood in Rochester, which is now the High Falls neighborhood near the Coca-Cola bottling plant, right in the city. And that's another great example where he talks about how that neighborhood changes. And it changes because the immigrants, they want to be near each other, but they also want a beautiful home in the suburbs with a large garden and fresh air, and they don't want to live near a factory. So New York City's terrible decline has been attributed by some people because immigrants had moved out and no one really replaced them because no one could get in. But in the 1965 reform, immigrants were able to come back into this country, and where did they move? They moved to where they could afford and where there were jobs. So they moved to New York City and to other cities. And so some urban historians argue, I'm not going to say it is fact because it's an argument that's been put forth, that New York City's revival was attributable to the 1965 law. And that if immigration was severely curtailed, cities like New York would suffer dramatically. And this is why you have the New York City mayor always arguing for finding a way for path towards citizenship of undocumented and so forth, because it's considered intimately tied to New York City's success. Now, I would say, as an upstater, as someone born and raised upstate and spent most of my career upstate, is that upstate is now beginning again to mirror New York City, where immigration is absolutely crucial to Syracuse, to Rochester, to Buffalo in turning around our cities and reviving neighborhoods. And I think we're all recognizing this. And so when refugee resettlement was severely curtailed, it was really of great concern to those of us living in Erie County and Monroe County and Onondaga County. So I would say this is not an upstate downstate divide at all. I'd say one of the threads that ties upstate to downstate is that we both have benefited from immigration. And I mention this because we're working on a book right now called Governing New York State Through Crises. And I've been talking a lot to a gal from Hofstra, who's chairman of the poli-sci department and a Buffalo native, who's lived the upstate downstate divide her whole life. And she's been talking a lot and doing a lot of research in this question of how immigration is impacting upstate New York. So that's kind of what made me think about her really interesting work. And her name is Dr. Carolyn Dudek. And as I say, she's a Buffalonian by birth, but has been living downstate for a long time because she's on faculty at Hofstra University and, on Long Island.
Oh, that sounds like a really interesting conversations to be had.
Yes, we might come back. Mayor Brown, Dr. Fred Floss, an economist, and I are co-editing the book. Because we team teach New York State government and budget at Buffalo State for our master's in public administration, our economics program, and our undergrads. And we run a New York State budget simulation. We teach it every spring. So the book we're working on is the crises that have rocked New York State for the last 50 years and how government dealt with it, and ultimately how it changed the way municipalities, counties, and Albany interact with each other.
Wow, bet there's a lot to say on that.
Yeah, so we could come back and do a University Express when the book is published. It'll still be a year or so before we're finished.
All right, cool. I'll mark it down. I think that might be really interesting. When you started talking about the different neighborhoods in Buffalo, right at the beginning of that, we had somebody put in, "That's me." So I'm not sure if it was one of the Polish neighborhoods or Italian or Irish. And then the last thing I'm seeing right now is we learned about the term paper son in a University Express class about Asian Americans.
Well, yeah, and in India and China, especially India, they call immigration law quota law. Isn't that interesting? Because of course, Southern Eastern Europeans, I mean, if you were raised in a Southern and Eastern European household, you knew about this Quota Act because your family talked about it all the time, like they don't want us. And it was extremely insulting to Southern and Eastern Europeans that there was a quota. And this they did not let up on. And that's where JFK was the person who really was able to take this forward and work with these groups that were fighting to eliminate these national quotas. It was considered a terrible, terrible insult to Southern and Eastern, the descendants of Southern and Eastern Europeans, that there'd be a quota against the countries that they hailed from, their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. So now it's happening, especially with Indians, but also Chinese, because of that 7% limit on green cards from any one country. And of course, we understand why there's a limit, because the American government doesn't want too much of one nationality to monopolize the green cards. But the problem is that green card through the H-1B is a skill. H-1B is a visa for a non-immigrant visa for skilled. You have to have at least a bachelor's degree or equivalent. And then the 20,000 or so extra that are available for H-1B, you have to have a master's or higher from a U.S. university. So the H-1B is to attract the skilled employment that we can't produce ourselves from the American population. That's what it's for. And the problem is that because of that 7%, only 9,800 Indians qualify each year for a green card. So here they are stranded on H-1B or another kind of visa. I think it's the L1, but don't quote me because I'm not an immigration lawyer. I keep saying I'm not an immigration lawyer. I'm a political scientist. I'm a policy person. And so what they are, as I mentioned, anecdotally, I know Indians who are stranded. Now, if you're a physician, you are so exceptional, this isn't a problem for you. But if you're a college professor, and unless you're a college professor at Harvard or Princeton, an Ivy or Johns Hopkins, these Duke, Stanford, it's very difficult for you to prove that you're exceptional in a way that they can. So if you're at the State University of New York, at Buffalo State or Fredonia or Oneonta or New Paltz, even though they're publishing, even though they have a PhD from a good university, they can't prove the exceptional. And so they are with every other H-1B waiting in line. And it's literally years. So if you read the Indian press, and I've read a lot of Indian press because so much of it is English language, fortunately. So you can go ahead and you can read the Indian press as an English speaker. And a lot of it is very, damning, calling it the quota law, because they see it as Americans discriminating against Indians who have the skills and want to be able to be long-term lawful permanent residents in the United States. So you can almost, see their angst. You can almost feel it if you yourself were a grandchildren or a child of a Southern or Eastern European immigrant. And if you're a child, you're probably, a little older because your family came in the 50s. There was a bump again after the war with refugee, and then a bump after the 1965 reform. And then after that, it pretty much ended because there was no longer the family reunification ability. Because once Italians aged out, they didn't have sisters and brothers, they had cousins. You can't sponsor cousins. So, and this is the same for Polish and so forth. I mean, Polish is a different situation because it was a satellite country. So there was our policy in the US of accepting refugees from communist countries. So that's the Polish situation after the war is different than the Italian because of communism. And so I think that if you think of it, if you put yourself in the shoes of your Italian grandparents or great grandparents, or the cousin that you visited but you weren't able to sponsor, well, Indians are in that situation because they have siblings that they would like to sponsor, and they can't because they're H-1B holders, or they have a spouse who's in this never land, and their spouse is trying to get work authorization and so on and so forth. So you can understand their point. You can see both sides of it. I don't take a stand on it. My only stand is that I think the bumping up to 20% is reasonable. I think that's a reasonable that will do good things for a few more thousand Indians and Chinese a year. That's what I think. But I think the Eagle Act, which was also put as an arrival legislation in the current 117th Congress, drops all quotas. You know that, the Eagle Act, no quotas at all. And this, of course, Indian and Chinese nationals are supporting. That's a pretty big change quite quickly for a country, a democracy that prides itself on incremental legislation. So if I would take a stand, I suppose the stand I'm taking is I support the change from 7% to 20%, but I don't support dropping it completely at this point because it would just wreak havoc in the green card system. We don't know. We'd have to see. Wait, you do this gradually, perform some studies, see how it's affecting the job market, and then make a decision from there rather than all at once. That would be the stand I would take.
That makes sense. It's a very complex process, it sounds like, all around. So thank you for explaining that, giving your input.
My pleasure.
So now I'm just seeing a bunch of thank yous. Thank you. Thank you for your time today. Thank you for explaining everything so clearly. I echo all of those. So wonderful to have you back. We appreciate your time. And to everyone who's on, thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your time, your attention, your great questions. I enjoy doing this, and I'll see you back for the next University Express, whatever that subject may be. Thanks, Kate.
Definitely. Thank you.